This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope. Adeleru-Balogun. Inflation has been the main factor influencing most macroeconomic decisions and policy directions in the past few weeks. This would influence microeconomic realities even this week as many countries tighten the cash liquidity flow. One of the things driving inflation up is the Ukraine-Russia crisis. Today, we'll look at how the war is specifically affecting Africa and how the continent is dealing with it. But first, let's start with the African business headlines. According to an executive at the world's largest airline association, Nigeria is withholding $450 million in revenue generated by international carriers operating in the country. As the country grapples with a chronic dollar shortage, Africa's largest economy has restricted access to foreign cash for imports and investors trying to repatriate gains. Kamal Al-Awadhi, vice president of the International Air Transport Association for Africa and the Middle East, described talks with Nigerian officials to release the funds as a hectic ride. The International Energy Association says Africa must act quickly to profit from its vast resources of natural gas that the world will only want until it can shift towards lower carbon technology. In its Africa Energy Outlook for 2022 published today, the IEA said Africa could be in a position by the end of the decade to export some 30 billion cubic meters to Europe, which is currently hungry for gas because it is trying to reduce its reliance on Russia. The group of 31 mostly industrialized countries said in a groundbreaking outlook in 2021 that achieving a UN goal of net zero emissions by mid-century meant that from this year, no investments in new fossil fuel were necessary. Guinea's interim president Mamadi Doumbouya has told mining company Rio Tinto and Chinese-backed winning consortium Simandou that they have 14 days to finalize a joint venture in Guinea's Simandou iron ore mine. Guinea has been more frustrated with the firms that own the massive deposit, which has remained undeveloped since Rio Tinto was awarded an exploratory license 25 years ago. And finally, Africa's technology-dominated startups will continue to attract investment even if at a slower pace following record venture capital funding in 2021. The sector has seen inflows of $2.7 billion since January, more than double the $1.2 billion in the first 5 months of last year, according to data collated by Future Growth Asset Management. In 2021, Nigeria and South Africa led the way as investment surged to $5.2 billion, according to Cape Town-based Future Growth. The financing will likely slow in the months ahead as U.S. investors, who brought in most of the money last year, retreat amid a global market downturn. And those are a few of your African business headlines at this time. After the break, let's look at how Africa has been dealing with the Ukraine-Russia war. Stay with us. As the world continues to battle runaway inflation, the continent is grappling with the factors that are driving up fuel, food, and other costs. The conflict has generated an increase in energy prices that is rippling around the globe, hurting consumers and pressuring world leaders to ease their pain. That conflict is the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, Professor Benedict Orama, President and Chairman of the Board of Directors of the African Export-Import Bank, AfriExim, said the current Ukraine crisis poses additional problems to Africa by restricting access to grains, fertilizers, and petroleum goods. He explained further that the bank is mindful that Africa's problems are for Africans to solve. AfriExim has once again stepped in with the launch of a $4 billion Ukraine Crisis Adjustment Trade Finance Program for Africa. And this is to help countries contain the short-term impacts of the crisis. And we'll, of course, get into that in the course of the conversation. Now, joining me today as we look at how Africa is dealing with the Ukraine-Russia war is Dr. X.N. Iraki, economist and professor of economics and business administration, who's joining me from Nairobi, Kenya. Dr. Iraki, once again, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are.
I will say good afternoon to you. So let's look at this. We've seen the impact of this war that started towards the end of February this year. And when we saw it, it made all of us actually really consider how much ties or how much imports we get from Russia and Ukraine. And they export many things, but they're both major suppliers of wheat and supply the continent 44% of the continent's wheat need. So beyond wheat and these other items, let's really look at how the conflict has hit Africa hard. What is it that Russia and Ukraine have been supplying us that has now become in short demand, or short supply, I would say?
We didn't know how much Africa is connected to Ukraine or Russia until the war came. Until we started realizing that a lot of wheat, a lot of food crops come from Ukraine or from Russia that we find in our supermarkets. For example, in Kenya, we didn't realize that a lot of cooking fat that we use has been coming from Ukraine. We didn't realize that fertilizer has been coming from Ukraine. We didn't realize that a lot of fuel that we use elsewhere is imported to Ukraine. For example, a lot of gas that goes to Western Europe comes from Ukraine. So the war made it clear that we are connected to Russia, we are connecting to Ukraine more than we expected. And that is now being demonstrated by what is happening to the price of basic goods like fuel, like food, like fertilizer. And we are all seeing that happening in all African countries, including Kenya.
So let's stay on this wheat conversation. Now, Egypt is often the world's top wheat buyer. And while the country saw an interesting rise in imports from Russia in March, because of course Russian ports are not actually closed, there was still not the case in the very beginning with when the war broke out and even now. But then also it's not the case for a number of other African countries. Some 21 other African countries import their wheat either from Russia or Ukraine. So in terms of options available to them, have we started seeing African countries look away from Russia and Ukraine in terms of their wheat supply?
It was not possible to look away from Russia and Ukraine immediately, but in the long run, we have to do that. So we have to think of how we can get wheat from South America. We have to think of how we can get wheat from another country like Australia that grow wheat. And more importantly, we may have to think of changing our diet. Who said we must eat bread? Who said we must eat food that is made from wheat? We might have to think about crops like potatoes. We might have to think more of crops like rice. So I think the solution to wheat is two. One, we go to other countries, and two, we change our diet. It's not that hard. In East Africa, we can start taking fufu instead of taking ugali or taking chapati, which is a popular food here.
So it's interesting you mentioned moving away from wheat, maybe looking at potato bread. There was a point in time in Nigeria that we looked at cassava bread and cassava flour. But these conversations often bring up the fact that the continent needs to diversify its wheat sources. And it's not just our wheat sources. With this particular situation of Russia and Ukraine, what else do we now need to diversify? Even though this is a long-standing conversation, a continent as big as ours, as blessed as ours, why are we importing wheat? Why are we still importing maize? Why are we unable to feed ourselves?
If I looked at statistics from most African countries, including Kenya, you discover that not a lot of money, a lot of investment goes to agriculture. Yet most Africans say they are small-scale farmers. So we are actually seeing the price of not investing enough in agriculture. There are a lot of land that can be converted into agricultural productivity through irrigation, or even planting new crops. Like in East Africa, you find everybody wants to grow maize, even when maize is not the best crop to grow. So I think the Ukraine crisis gives us an opportunity for African countries to focus more on agriculture, so that we don't just import food, but we can grow it. Africa has some of the world's best farmlands, but we have not exploited them. Even banks don't give enough credit to agriculture. Not enough students, for example, study agriculture in African universities. And even in the media, you rarely find people talking about agriculture unless there is a famine. So it's a time to focus on agriculture so that we can become self-sufficient.
Very true. So let's look at something else the war is affecting that many may not be taking notice of, and that is Africa's debt. Now, a combination of the pandemic that we're struggling to recover from and now the war in Russia and Ukraine has reduced trade and taxation revenues for governments across the country, across the continent. And we're also seeing that countries are being forced to spend more on some form of social safety nets and palliatives. Downgraded credit ratings have increased borrowing for African countries. And UNDP research actually shows that biased credit ratings could be costing 6 African countries about $13 billion in additional interest rate payments. Basically, Africa is borrowing much higher than the rest of the world. So when it comes to our debt and this war, what do you think is going to happen? Where is this war leaving Africa's debts?
We have already seen the effect of that. In fact, I think last month or early this month, the government of Kenya cancelled a Eurobond that was supposed to fraud. The cost was too high. So this war is making Africa debt more expensive and probably might make it unsustainable. So it could not have come at a worse time, because if you look at other countries like the Rock countries, they have very good revenue base, but tax revenue base. Africa doesn't have that. So because we don't have that money, we have to buy more and more debt, and debt is becoming more expensive. So I fear what some African countries might do is to start focusing on the domestic market. And that is going to lead to the crowding effect, where the government takes money instead of private investors like you and me. That is going to lead to a serious crowding effect. So I think the debt, the problem in Ukraine is having a more serious effect in Africa than we expected, particularly in terms of debt. So we either have to cut to live within our means, or we pay more expensive debt, or look at revenue streams that from African countries, like we can start getting tax from areas we never thought about. I know there's already a very big debate on taxing digital services, which a lot of countries are resisting. But we may have to think of taxing areas we never thought about, so that we don't have to pay so much debt, so much interest when we borrow a lot of money in the Western countries or Western banks.
I'd be interested to hear what these areas you think that we don't focus on in terms of taxation, because if it's a conversation to be had now, I'm very sure you'll find a lot of no's across the continent. Fuel prices are up, food prices are up, everything is up. And this is not the time anybody would want to hear that their government is looking at raising taxes. Are there other areas where African countries have not fully explored the taxation conversation?
Well, one of them is digital taxes, because when COVID came, a lot of services went online. A lot of money is made online. So the government of Kenya, the government of other African countries could raise some tax revenue from digital services. Number two is in small and micro enterprises, which don't pay a lot of tax. So we could probably bring more people in the tax bracket so that the tax burden is shared. But I believe there is new areas that we can focus on. We may not raise a lot of taxes, but under the given circumstances, any extra tax is welcome.
So this situation has also led to historically high, well, maybe not necessarily so historic, but some high level of crude oil prices that are higher than we've seen in the past few years. Early this morning, Brent crude was at $113 per barrel, and countries like Nigeria and Angola should have been making some windfall from these higher oil prices, but that's not the case. Why are crude oil producers, particularly on the continent, not doing as well as expected and are actually feeling the pinch as well as the rest of the world?
If you look at the production of crude oil, it's very labor intensive, very capital intensive. So even if the price of oil goes up, you don't expand the production capacity overnight. There's always a delay, because you have to bring new machines. You have to explore new oil fields. You have to train new people how to use those machines and so on. So because of that intensity in capital, you cannot benefit immediately. You have to wait for some time so that you can expand the productive capacity. You can come up with new oil wells. You can come up with new people to work in those places. But more importantly, the other reason why you may not benefit is because the price of other items are going up. So the money you are going to make from extra price of oil is gobbed up or eaten by other services, food, accommodation, and other services. The price is going up. So the extra money you make from oil is eaten elsewhere. But I think those are the two main reasons why some countries that are producing oil may not benefit a lot. And I don't want to add that some of them have debts to pay.
Yes, we have debts to pay and we have issues predating the Russia-Ukraine war. Dr. Iraki, I want you to hold on. There's a lot of conversation around the opportunities that Africa has in this situation, and also around some of the socio-economic or the geo-economic conversations happening. I want us to take a look at that when we come back. This is a conversation that's looking at how the continent is dealing with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and the conversation will continue right after this. Still with me is Dr. Exen Iraki, economist and associate professor of economics and business administration. Now, while some see this as an opportunity to build economic capacity from within the continent, others have opened the door for the Russian government to reshape its approach towards Africa. Earlier this year, Russian oil companies were present across the continent. However, Cameroon, Nigeria, the DRC, and Equatorial Guinea would be the most affected if the war in Ukraine becomes a prolonged battle, as exploration activities by key Russian companies such as Lukoil and Tatneft are at risk. Final investment decisions and development projects are expected to be delayed in Cameroon and Ghana because of possible international sanctions against Lukoil. In Equatorial Guinea, Lukoil has already withdrawn from operating the giant and deep water Fortuna underdeveloped gas project, even as the contract remains valid. And in Libya, Congo, and Egypt, crude oil and natural gas production also stand to suffer from the sanctions, including, for example, delays at the loading terminals in Libya's Zutenia port. Africa is a bystander in this war, and there are those who want the continent to take a position on one side of the fence or the other. So let me bring my guest back in here. Dr. Iraki, when you look at some of the moves that Russia has been making in the recent past, in the past few years, we've seen a Russia-Africa Congress or meeting that's been happening. We've seen Putin extending his hands, and there are also historic ties here on the continent, the Soviet Union being part of some of the country's independent struggles, and now we've seen Russian companies getting involved in the oil and gas sector. There are economic ties to this, but the West particularly would like Africa to pick a side, preferably their side. But when it comes to the economics of this, can Africa continue to stand apart as just a bystander, an interested party, but a bystander nonetheless?
One of the most interesting observations I've seen is since the Ukraine war came, very few African countries have come openly and said whether they are supporting Russia or they are opposing Russia. They are taking a middle position. But I think if you look at what is happening in Africa as far as the Ukraine war is concerned, Africa needs to take a position. We have already mentioned that a lot of Russian oil companies are exporting in Africa. They are looking for oil. So if we talk against Russia, then those investments might be withdrawn. If we talk in favor of Russia, then the West sees Africa as taking the wrong position. So Africa is a bystander, as you put it, but I think we need to stop being a bystander. And the best way to do that is to develop our own resources. We need to develop capacity. We need to make enough money so that when it comes to exploring oil, we can get it from the ground ourselves. We don't have to rely on multinational corporations to exploit our own resources. So that when it comes to such major decisions as the war in Ukraine, we can make a position. We can say whether we are supporting Russia or not supporting Russia. But as long as we are depending on other powers to exploit our resources, whether it is oil or gas, I think African countries will be silent for a long time. And I think that's not good for us.
Yeah, very true. So when you look at some of these deals that are possibly having to be put on hold now, what do you think the future will be? Lukoil has exploration activities in Cameroon, Nigeria, DRC, Equatorial Guinea. Ghana is involved. There are projections and development projects that are now on hold. Contracts are still open. And these are things that African countries need investment for to see the viability and to see them come to fruition. How do you think that's going to play out for the energy sector?
This sector is going to be in a state of abyss for poison when exporting. And I see other Western companies like Shell and the rest trying to fill the void that is being left by Russian oil contractors, the oil exporters. But I think the best approach would be for us to exploit our own oil, not depend on the others. That will not happen immediately because, as we said earlier, a lot of resources are needed. But I think with the time, things are going to play themselves out. And I can tell you for sure in another 2 or 3 years, there will be people exporting oil from Africa and mostly African themselves. We are going to learn our lessons.
So in response to this crisis, we have major organizations like the Afri-Exim Bank, which are trying to step in and bridge the gap. So Afri-Exim has announced the establishment of a $4 billion adjustment trade finance program for African countries. And the program aims to help countries reduce the short-term impact of the Ukraine crisis. When you hear that Afri-Exim, which also has some connections elsewhere outside of the continent, is stepping into this gap, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm a very happy African because finally we are taking responsibility for our own problems. But when in the past, if we had a crisis like the current one, people would be hearing of IMF, people would be hearing of World Bank. But now we have an African-owned institution that is coming to help African countries deal with the Ukraine crisis. So I think it's a good development, and we need to develop our institutions so that we don't always rely on other people when there is such a crisis. So we hope that the African Export-Import Bank is going to fill the void and expand, and so that in future crises, it will always be there to help African countries deal with such an economic crisis. It's very good news.
So in terms of the sectors that should receive some of this funding and intervention, do we have the details of where the money will be going?
I would like that amount of money to go to agriculture because agriculture is vital to any country. If you look at the amount of food we have been exporting from Ukraine or from other countries, then there are chances of some African countries going without food. Remember that the weather has not been on our side. There have been reports of floods. There have been reports of drought in some African countries. So I think the first priority we should focus on, as far as this bank financing is concerned, is food and possibly health, and very important, exploration of new energy sources. I want the bank to fund alternative energy sources instead of depending on oil. Can we have more solar? Can we have more gas? Can we have more wind? But we diversify from oil-based energy sources.
That does make sense. So at the beginning of this conversation, I did mention the inflation that has been running away. We've seen the U.S. Federal Reserve and the Bank of England also responding. We've seen some response on the continent as well, and that's where I want us to go to next. In terms of African central banks trying to sort of cushion their economies from the impact of this inflation, what do you think has been done? Do you think what has been done is even enough? Is anybody getting it right?
I think African central banks have done exactly what I saw the Western countries doing. They are raising interest rates, but they can cool the economy. But I think we need to go beyond just raising the interest rates. We need to improve the productive capacity of our agriculture so that those items whose prices are going up, we can produce more. We can produce more food. We can produce more oil so that the rules of supply and demand come into being. If we produce more oil, if we produce more food, inflation will definitely go down. I think raising interest is one of the ideas of dealing with inflation. There are other ways we can use, like increasing the supply of those other commodities that are important to the country and whose prices are now.
So there are a number of economists and analysts who have said they fear that the world is entering a period of stagflation. Do you agree with them? Are you in that same line of thoughts with how the world economy is going right now?
I think it is going to depend largely to the extent the measures central banks are taking are going to be active. If you look at the US, they increase the interest rates, Bank of England, I think Australia, and a number of other countries. If the interest rate hike reduces inflation, then we might reduce the chances of stagflation. But more important, we need to have Ukrainians and Russians sit, talk, negotiate, and then we come up with a peace deal. I don't think we need to keep on suffering because two countries are fighting one another. That's a much easier solution than using the economic measures we are taking.
All right, finally, Dr. Iraki, the NATO chief over the weekend said that the war in Ukraine could last for years. And in just a short period of a few months, we've seen how harsh the fallout has been, the repercussions of this war has been for African countries. If the conflict continues as many are predicting, how dire do you think Africa's situation could be in the coming months?
I think it could be dire, but we have a lesson that was similar to that. If you remember, around 1973, the oil prices hit through the roof. There was a crisis in the Middle East. And at the time, the economies adjusted to higher oil prices. So I believe that if our political leaders, if the economists, if the thinkers are able to put their might together, there will be a solution to the current problem. But I fear that the more this war drags, the more it affects economies, not just in Africa, but all over the world. So we need every person to come and to put in certain effort. We need to talk to one another. We need to solve this problem because it's not a Ukraine-Russian problem. It's a global problem. It's affecting everybody. So everybody should be involved in trying to bring an end to this war.
All right, Dr. Iraki, thank you as always for answering our call. We'll be talking to you soon.
Thank you and have a good afternoon.
The same to you. And prior to 2020, African countries were among the fastest growing in the world. The COVID-19 pandemic reversed decades of hard-won macroeconomic, socioeconomic, and governance gains on the continent. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Africa's Human Development Index dropped. Millions of Africans lost their jobs, and some 50 million were projected to be pushed into extreme poverty. African countries put in place effective macroeconomic policies, made strategic investments, and boosted COVID-19 vaccine production and rollout. And by the end of 2021, Africa exceeded expectations of a 3.7% GDP growth, recording a 4.5% growth rate. It was a fragile recovery, and now, with the war in Ukraine, that recovery is being threatened. Can Africa find a way back to the path of recovery? You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, Lekan Onobanjo is standing by to give you the latest in the international business scene.